hello, and good Friday or Saturday morning to those of you out there in the CrimsonCast audience. I'm Galen Clavio, and it is time for us to finish our preparations this week for Indiana at Iowa. We've got Taylor Lehman from Bite Sized Bison joining us on the show as we get ready to statistically and other forms of math, I guess, preview Indiana, Iowa, talk about what we need to be talking about. Taylor, it's great to have you back. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, Galen. It's week 5. I'm definitely welcoming the bye week. I'll just say that after this one.
It's been a lot to start the season, and I'm not complaining. It's great to have college football back. It's great to have this IU team back. It's been a fun start to the year. I know we're kind of feeling the same effects, like having 4 home games in a row. From a tailgating perspective is a big outlay, and I know just kind of getting your head around the statistics is a big one as well. So it is, I think, a great break point for the first half of the season coming up after this Iowa game. And it is going to be fascinating to watch all of these storylines converging with the idea that regardless of what happens, Indiana's got to bye afterwards to address the next phase of things this season. And we're going to talk about the Iowa-related items. We'll do a little cleanup from last week as well, and just kind of try to spotlight the various things that we think are important for you folks to understand. Some of you are driving out to Iowa. Hopefully you're getting a chance to listen to this while you're making the drive. Others are not, and you're going to be at home watching the game or out at a bar or a restaurant. So wherever you are, we hope that you have a great time. We hope this podcast gives you some ideas about what to expect. Quickly, before we get started, just a reminder, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. We got the Bison hoodie going again. You got the CFP hoodie. I like the vibes here. We've kind of turned into fall. We're officially in fall, so we are officially in football, like seasonal weather time. And it was amazing being in Memorial Stadium last week with 56,000 plus people, biggest crowd in Memorial Stadium history, ton of Home Field apparel all over the place. And if you haven't stopped by Home Field at Tracks, be sure to do that on Kirkwood Avenue. Use the code HOME23 if you are shopping online and get 15% off your first order. Let them know that we sent you. They always enjoy that. Anyway, let's go ahead and dive in. And Taylor, I guess first and foremost, let's just briefly talk about what we witnessed last week. You and I were both pretty optimistic from a statistical perspective about what Indiana might do against Illinois. Neither of us in our wildest expectations would have been able to anticipate that win. And I just wanted to get your impression as you were watching it and then as you reviewed it afterwards. How surprising was the nature of the win and the way that it came about for IU, and what stuck out to you the most as far as what that said, in your opinion, about where this IU team is at in 2025?
Yeah, I'll say, I am just kind of shocked. I had them at a 19% plus net success rate. So 19% more success on offense than they allowed Indiana. And I think I would say I'm surprised because I thought Illinois was a little better, and I still think that's a good football team. I just think Indiana. I think it was a statement game. They even have the national media saying it. Like this team might be better than last year's Indiana team, and it's kind of what I think a lot of people within the IU fan base anticipated. I had thoughts that it probably might be, as good as last year's team, maybe even better. There's so much retention, and then they added talent. They just boosted the floor of the team. But there were still question marks. And I think a lot of those things kind of, if they weren't answered, the concern was eased. If there are many concerns for the team. And yeah, man, I was just kind of surprised at how little resistance Illinois provided.
Yeah, I mean, we see these in basketball sometimes. We don't see them as much in football, but there are just games where it just gets completely away from you. And it was surprising that it happened with Illinois, given that they'd already played on the road. against a power conference team in Duke. They'd played a bunch of games last year that were close. And it's where I think it's probably where a lot of the shock that resonated throughout the college football landscape came from, because that just doesn't seem like the type of team that has that happen to them. And especially with a Brett Bielema coached team in the Big Ten, because Arkansas teams maybe a different story, but there's huge talent disparities in the SEC where those happen. I don't think there's a huge talent disparity between Illinois and Indiana, but there was clearly a tremendous execution gap, and there was clearly a point in the game where Illinois just stopped being able to compete. And that is rare in the Big Ten for good teams. We've seen bad teams stop competing, certainly, but not a lot of good ones. And so I do sometimes wonder with that, it's like, at what point did it cease being a competitive game? At what point did it leap into garbage time? Can you really have garbage time when you're playing the 9th-ranked team in the country? I think all these are legitimate questions, because a lot of it goes back to this idea of what you said of a statement game, and this idea that I think one of my favorite sub-narratives from this past week was Curt Cignetti, man, he's a stone cold killer. Like, that guy's a psychopath. Like, I mean, these are the literal things I've heard people say.
Oh, for running up the score.
Running up the score.
Yep.
I didn't see any running up of the score.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they stopped passing late in the third quarter. They pulled their starters at the beginning of the fourth quarter. They were running the ball.
Kobe Martin ran the ball.
Grant Wilson outran Illinois by himself. These are the things where you're just kind of like, this was less about, I think it was a statement game up to a point, and then it was like, well, you're just rolling them at that point, and Illinois has basically rolled up the tents and said, all right, we're out of here. We're not even going to try at this point. So I always think about that in terms of, that's what gets the attention of the national media, and you understand so, but also for Indiana, that's an interesting place to be, in as much as you want to feel good dominating a team that's in the top 10, dominating a team that statistically going into the game was a top 20, top 25 team, was kind of very similar to Indiana in terms of where it landed in SP Plus or landed in FPI. You beat them by that much. You want to take confidence from the win. You also don't want to get overconfident and say, well, wow, we're that much better than a top 10 team. How good might we actually be? It's an interesting balance to try to strike as a football coaching staff and as a team, just how to process all of that as you go into what's going to be another tough game.
Yeah, Galen, I think the where I, gain the most comfort is in what Brett Bielema said after the game, when he said that they didn't have any answers, and that kind of showed schematic dominance, which also comes back to the staff. It's not just the players in the field. It's what we've said. It's what we said last year too. On different episodes of CrimsonCast, that this coaching staff is just as responsible as the players in terms of preparation, and maybe more so for preparation. But setting up these game plans and also making in-game adjustments, it's something that I think is probably the most jarring thing about Indiana football. And during the Curt Cignetti stretch, is just how consistently good the game plans are going into each game. And if they're not, the in-game adjustments that are made afterwards. Like, I mean, Fernando Mendoza got sacked on the second play of that game, and the first score was the D'Angelo Pons blocked punt. And so that obviously that helps things. But, then at a certain point, Indiana just didn't, that they couldn't stop scoring. I think you said it on your post-game episode, where it took the period whistle to stop Indiana from scoring touchdowns on a couple occasions. And so I think that's where I take the most comfort, is that it's not the players with a roster that's comprised of kids and their younger 20s needing to execute. It's also like the adults in the room who are preparing for these opponents and preparing the team for these opponents. Like Bryant Haynes and Mike Shanahan deserve a ton of credit, especially obviously Bryant Haynes is fantastic. Mike Shanahan, that last game, like when we were just talking about how Grant Wilson got it in an outrushed Illinois, and they were out executing Illinois with their 2s and 3s, and that's Mike Shanahan. Like that's the scheme, and that's prepping those players.
Yeah, it's really impressive, and this is one of the reasons why IU shelled out so much money to keep this staff
Yeah.
almost intact. Obviously, Tino Sunseri heads out to California and joins the UCLA staff, but there's a reason why they ponied up so much money for Brian Haynes. There's a reason why they ponied up money to keep Mike Shanahan. I mean, it's it's one of those underrated secret sauce things with as much as Kurt Signetti gets deserved attention nationally, his ability to not just retain his staff and have very, 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 very effective guys in a bunch of these different roles, but to curate the staff in a way where he clearly trusts them with what they're doing, and they clearly are dialed in. I mean, we have really, I don't know that we've seen a game yet that Indiana's played in the Signetti era where they have been out schemed. I think you could make the argument that against Ohio State, they just got out physicaled, and the crowd noise I think clearly hurt them. And I would say in the Notre Dame game, it was a similar kind of thing. Like it just felt like there was a physical disparity along the lines that Indiana mostly couldn't overcome. And even with that, the Notre Dame game was closer, I think, than people give it credit for from a statistical perspective.
Yeah.
But it's been the secret sauce of this team and this coaching staff now for a year and a half almost. And wow, I mean, talk about something that is the envy of college football and something that I don't know that IU fans really even know how to process. It's fascinating watching this staff. It's not just the way that they scheme, but it's the manner in which they adjust in game when things aren't going well initially. We saw it last year in the Michigan State game. We saw it last year in the Maryland game. We saw it this year, I think, in this Illinois game where those first few possessions, it was kind of up in the air about whether Indiana's offense was going to get untracked. The defense was struggling at times. They get burned on that long play, but they are also giving up some runs, some chunk yardage. And then once they started to figure out where the pressure points were that they could attack with Illinois on both sides of the ball, it was just remarkable to watch it unfold and get worse and worse for Illinois as the game went along. And that really fit the template of what we saw last year in the Nebraska game, in the Michigan State game, even in the Michigan game, although that one almost went in reverse where it's like the scheming got them a large enough lead where the physical mismatches that you were seeing on the line didn't hurt them badly enough that they lost the game.
Yeah, absolutely. I would push back a bit on the not being out schemed last year. I think Jim Knowles out schemed Mike Shanahan last year at Ohio State and Notre Dame as well. But I don't think I think the defense ended up becoming the strength at the end there. I don't think they were ever out schemed defensively. But that's what is so encouraging about this team is that it seems like they're approaching the season a bit differently, in that we're seeing so many different facets of the offense this year. I think Mike Shanahan, I think this is more the roster that he was hoping to have. And last year, they played one tight end. They had Zach Horton, and now they have two. And that changes so many things with what he can do with a 12 personnel. Having two tight ends you can really trust, and they can both block, they can both catch. And so I think that has a lot to do with it. I also think I think the offensive line might be a tad better this year. I think that's still to be determined. That's my inclination, my hunch. And then also, Fernando Mendoza, he offers so much. He's kind of Curtis Rourke was fantastic last year. Fernando Mendoza fits Mike Shanahan's system a bit better in terms of the quick reads, quick releases. He's just a little bit quicker than Curtis Rourke, and also still has that mobility that Curtis Rourke obviously couldn't have last year. So, I think things could get scary for Indiana opponents. So, we still haven't really seen that's why I think this Iowa game is so important, because we haven't seen the horizon for either side of or we haven't been to the horizon for either side of the ball. And I think the trenches is one of those things. I don't think Illinois' offensive line was very good. And I think their defensive front might also be a little bit overrated too. So I don't think that's the case for Iowa. I think Iowa has solid fronts on both sides. So that'll be kind of a statement, particularly for Indiana's defensive line, I think.
We'll dive into Iowa in just a second. First of all, Taylor, of course, joining us from Bite Sized Bison, the best IU football newsletter that you can subscribe to. There's a QR code up in the upper right-hand corner of your screen if you're watching on YouTube or Spotify. Scan that and go, and it'll take you right to bitesizedbison.substack.com. Subscribe. It's well worth that. What is it? What's the cost right now for football season, Taylor?
It's in season. Monthly is $8. Yearly is $50.
Well, that's a hell of a deal, given everything that's going on. I mean, it really, really is. And so I'm excited to see that. I'm excited that hopefully people get out and read your stuff. So go use that QR code, or you can just go type in bitesizedbison.substack.com, and you can get all of what Taylor is laying down, including the statistics that I'm about to flash up here on the screen as we dive in to this preview of Iowa and Indiana. Let's start with the chart. We enjoy the big chart. The chart is always a favorite, and I'm going to get it called up here for those of you who are watching along. For those of you who aren't, we will certainly try to describe it as best we can. But looking at this matchup, it's funny. I increasingly, one of my biggest joys is listening to the national media react in shock when a line opens at like 3 or 3.5 and then migrates to like 8.5 or 9. And then you look at S&P Plus and, oh, gosh, look at that. The line is 9. So it's almost as if, they're trying to capture some early money knowing that the line's going to go the other direction. That's exactly what happened last week against Illinois. Yep. It happens here again. Indiana, 72% win probability according to SP Plus, 30-21 the projected score. So as much as we've heard people say, well, 8.5 is too much to be getting on the road, it's basically what the statistics are telling us. Looking at the way that these two teams line up, Indiana in FPI is 6th in the country. In SP Plus, they're 6th in the country. Iowa is 31st in FPI and 35th in SP Plus. So these two teams are pretty evenly rated across the two metrics. Indiana really very, very consistent across the board. 10th offensively, 11th defensively, 10th in special teams. Iowa 61st offensively, 19th defensively, 21st in special teams. Looking at the matchups and the overall numbers, what stands out to you as things that IU fans should know about both of these teams and where they line up in terms of the statistics?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of people think of, when they think of Iowa, they think of, special teams and turnovers, like just very fundamental things. Like they win the turnover margin. That's how they win games. And they have great punting teams and great, their special teams are fantastic. But honestly, this year it hasn't really shown that much. And so like Iowa has only forced 2 turnovers all season, and that ranks like 116th in the country. And their punting unit is not all that impressive either. Really, the special teams jump that Iowa gets is because of their fantastic returner, probably the best returner in the country, Weegan. And Indiana's going to have to game plan for how to kick to him, which is one thing that I am watching this week. That's probably Iowa's biggest weapon, to be honest. So I think that, just like the identity of this Iowa program over decades, it just isn't as strong this year as it has been previously. So that's one thing that I would note. Another is that Iowa's explosion rate is 3rd in the country. They allow explosive plays on 3.6% of plays. That's great, but also Indiana doesn't gain much explosion, and they've still been extremely efficient. And so it's one of those things where Iowa works within these set of parameters, and I wrote about this in BSB for the preview. They're just like kind of elite in achieving this very narrow amount of success on each play, and as much as they allow and as much as they gain. And it's a very small amount of success, but it's not very negative, which kind of goes back to what Kirsten said in his press conference, which is they're not going to beat themselves. You have to beat them. So they're going to dare teams to win the game. And I think that's the difference between, a Kirsignetti Indiana and maybe like a Tom Allen Indiana. Is they will dare to win the game in ways that, frustrated Indiana fans when Tom Allen was the head coach. So I think those are the things that jump out immediately, Galen, when I look at this this advanced stats chart, when I look at the chart.
Yeah, it is interesting because you and I have talked throughout the course of the season on the explosive play rate with Indiana about
Mhm.
how a lot of what they're doing isn't quite, it doesn't fall into the definition of explosive play. And just so people know what we're talking about, what is an explosive play in terms of a rush and a pass, just to refresh people who don't know.
For sure, yeah. The to achieve an explosive play, in BSB terms, and some other folks who are leaders in college football analytics, is 2.4 EPA on a passing play, and a 1.8 EPA on a rushing play. Those are very big plays, and so Indiana has achieved what I've started to call semi-explosion, where they achieve a lot of like twos on passing plays. So just short of the 2.4, but still two, and which is why you can have big Omar Cooper plays that maybe aren't necessarily considered explosive. The Riley Nowakowski screenplay was considered explosive. And so there have been some explosive plays, but just not at a very high rate at this point in the season compared to some other teams, which you know, it's not too surprising, to be honest, because when you look at, I was just looking at how many times Fernando Mendoza has thrown further than 20 yards downfield. It's only 13, which is not very much. He threw seven passes that were further than 20 yards downfield in week 1. And since then, it's just been 6 because they haven't needed to, but
Right.
he can do it. And which I actually think he will a few more times against this Iowa team that kind of got exposed. Rutgers threw 10 times past the 20-yard mark. So, and they completed 4 of them and drew penalties on 2 of them. So I think there's going to be success downfield. It's just how often does Mike Shanahan want to try that? And, I think they could really find some success against Iowa's free safety. So, I think the middle of the field is going to be there, especially deeper downfield, which is where Mike Shanahan likes to play. And so, I think this could be a really successful passing game, which shows in this chart, Galen. I think they allow the 66th highest passing success rate in the country.
Right.
So I think passing is going to be one path towards success for Indiana. I'm just curious how much they lean on it.
And, it's a real advantage for Indiana on both sides of the ball. Indiana's second in the country in passing success. As you mentioned, Iowa's defense 66th in stopping passing success. And then on the flip side, Iowa's offense 97th in the country in passing success, and Indiana's defense 5th best. Now, they haven't played a ton of teams that have thrown the ball much or had the ability to throw it effectively with Illinois. I mean, Illinois should have been able to move the ball in the air better than they were, and that's where I think you can look at that and really be like, wow, okay, that looks great for Indiana. One of the other things that's interesting about this game that really sticks out to me is this whole idea of, we talked going into Illinois last week about Indiana's struggles in the red zone and converting in the red zone. How did you feel the game against Illinois addressed some of those concerns in your mind?
I think I'm still a little concerned. I think there's still rushing plays there that just aren't finding success in the red zone, and I think it's just because defensive coordinators change their entire philosophy when you get inside that 20-yard line. They really start to stack the box. They start to maintain, outside contain, and then crash in. And so, they start to bring in safeties. So I think that there's a lot of different things that come at an offense when you get into the red zone. And so I think, I think there's still more to be seen from Indiana's red zone rushing attack. I will say Iowa allowed at least one red zone rushing touchdown against Rutgers. So that's encouraging, and I think it's there for Indiana. I want to see it before I feel confident about it. But I mean, I will say Iowa, and I wrote about this in the BSB too. Iowa, they are. What is it? They're 98th in the country in EPA allowed when opponents pass their 40-yard line. So when they get into Iowa territory past that 40-yard line, Iowa has not been good defensively. They've allowed 7 touchdowns on 11 red zone trips, which that touchdown rate is 83rd in the country. and a lot of them have been passes. Not a lot of teams have ran for scores on Iowa. So I think I think I think that fits well for what Mike Shanahan likes to do in the red zone. So I'm not too concerned going into this game about the red zone rushing attack because I think the passing will be there. I'm more concerned when they start playing like Oregon and Penn State.
When you talk about Iowa's offense and Indiana's defense, one of the things that really stands out is this is an Iowa team that is very much focused on the run. And, even though there was a lot of ballyhoo about Mark Gronowski, who had a great deal of success at South Dakota State, coming in as the different type of Iowa quarterback, the type of Iowa quarterback we haven't seen, one that would open up the passing game. It just really hasn't worked out that way so far. He's having what is so far a season where he's got the lowest completion percentage of his career. I think he's at like 60.9% coming into the game. We talked about the lack of success in the passing game, just in terms of the statistics. It's interesting because so much of what we've heard talked about is this idea that Iowa is this ground and pound team that's got running backs, and I keep hearing they have a running quarterback, which I'm sorry, no, Mark Gronowski is not a running quarterback by any definition that I've seen a running quarterback. That doesn't mean that he can't be dangerous on occasion, but this is not a guy who's doing a ton of designed runs or picking up a huge amount of yardage on a regular basis. He was a little bit of that earlier in his career at South Dakota State, but he was more of a pure passer in his last 2 years at South Dakota State. And thus far, even though Iowa's had a great deal of success in the rush, it's really been just through a very conventional running attack, as opposed to being something where they're throwing a ton of weapons out there.
Yeah. I think the thing about Mark Gronowski is that he's a big body quarterback that has some athletic ability. They will design runs for him, but none of them have been super successful. Like you were saying, Galen, he's not ripping off chunks of yardage. His longest carry is 13 yards. And so, it's somebody you have to account for it. That's for sure. But he's not going, like, if you don't account for it on a play, he's not going to turn into Colton Joseph and run 75 yards past your defense. And so, but I will say when you get into the red zone, that's when he becomes really dangerous on the ground. He has 6 rushing touchdowns, which is more than any other quarterback, at least in the Big Ten. And definitely he's tied for third among all ball carriers in the FBS in rushing touchdowns with 6. So, they turn to like an RPO style offense when they get into the red zone and like an option offense. And so, I think that's dangerous. But yeah, I mean, I think he's had a hard time adjusting to the FBS and the Big Ten level because he has the highest pressure responsibility rate of any quarterback in the FBS. He's responsible for 48% of the QB pressures that he's felt. And so, that really helps an offensive line's PFF grade, which a lot of people have been talking about is how good Iowa's offensive line has been. But if you have a good offensive line, they can only hold off the defensive front for so long. So I think it's going to get better for Mark Gronowski. I think he's going to get better as the season goes on, but he's hitting Indiana right now at a pretty tough time in their schedule.
Yeah. I mean, on the season so far, he's, like you said, 6 touchdowns, but only 143 total yards on 46 carries, a 3.1 yards per carry average. And as you mentioned, a long of 13. I think it's important to keep in mind with Gronowski, like South Dakota State is a very, very good FCS program.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, like the leap up to the Big Ten, even behind an offensive line as good as Iowa's is, that's a big leap for someone coming out of that level. We haven't seen a ton of players be able to do that effectively. It does happen occasionally, but it's a different kind of setup. And what's going to be fascinating is, so far on the year, he's thrown 81 passes through the first 4 games of the season for Iowa. So you're talking about roughly 20 passes per game. And I'm fascinated at this point, given how much Indiana abused Illinois' offensive line in the passing game and how they weren't getting receivers open early. When Iowa does eventually have to pass, how good is Iowa's offensive line going to be at protecting Gronowski? Was all of Indiana's success due to just a bad Illinois offensive line, or can they get similar types of pressure on Gronowski? Because I'm assuming, as with Illinois, they're probably not bringing a lot of extra guys. They're probably, at least not in pass rush directly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, I think the thing about Iowa's offensive line is they were not very effective against Iowa State, and Iowa State's defensive front is not necessarily fantastic. They're ranked like somewhere in the top 40 and defensive front havoc, which is, it's good, but it's not Indiana, and so Indiana's number one in that metric, and that's kind of the strength of the team, and is the defensive front. And so, while they faced Iowa State, they didn't play particularly well. They still allowed, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but several tackles for a loss, several sacks. And so, I think it might be one of those situations where a lot of people were talking a lot about Illinois' offensive line. A lot of people are talking about Iowa's offensive line. And I think this might be another situation where, Iowa's offensive line might get a little exposed here, because the next best defensive front they've played in terms of defensive front havoc is Rutgers, and they're ranked 98th in the country in defensive front havoc. So they just haven't played a ton of great fronts, and the one that they played that was above average, they didn't look fantastic. So I think there's some returning to the mean that the offensive line is going to be doing pretty soon, especially with the schedule coming up even after Indiana.
Right. Absolutely. Looking at Gronowski's individual numbers, some interesting things to note. This is a quarterback that does his best work on first and second down. Third down has been a bit of a struggle, which makes sense because that's generally a passing down, which kind of feeds into what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
He has not thrown a ton of passes. They've clustered largely around Jacob Gill and Seth Anderson. And you look at just overall what you're talking about. I mean, what I found, I think what leapt out to me, as much as the book on Iowa is that they don't beat themselves, it is interesting that his turnover worthy throws percentage is 48%. Like that's got to be a little frightening against what has been a fairly ball hawking Indiana defense so far in the secondary.
Yeah, I will say, Galen, that raw number is only 3. Well, so there are a lot of FBS quarterbacks that have not committed a ton of turnover worthy plays at this point. But you're right. I mean, when you're talking relatively speaking, for other quarterbacks, I would even say that there were more plays where he could have turned the ball over, and in terms of like fumbles, and because he carries the ball so often. And so, I think. I think you're right. I think a lot of the responsibility does end up falling on Gronowski. They kind of built, like Kirsten they said, they built the offense for this guy. I think that's why everybody was so excited about Mark Gronowski. He was like this big bodied guy that could also throw. He threw for over, was it 10,000 yards at South Dakota State, won 52 games in 4 seasons. Like, he was extremely successful. And then, and then putting him in an Iowa offense where there could be runs designed for this guy who shows some athletic ability and an arm, that offered some promise, but it hasn't really, panned out at this point.
Yeah, and look, I mean, they're 3-1, but they did lose that game to Iowa State, and I think it's important to keep in mind. Like, I mean, it's a rivalry game. It's always a game that's junky. It's normally 20-19 or 16-13, which it was this year. But it is important to note that the other 3 games they played were Albany, UMass, who's terrible, and at Rutgers, who normally is pretty good defensively, but as we were noting, like, Rutgers let up almost as many points to Ohio as they let up to Iowa. They let up, I think, 17 points to Miami of Ohio. It doesn't look like a vintage Greg Schiano defense. So I do wonder if some of looking at that and saying, well, Iowa is a real offense, it's like you may want to pump the brakes a little bit, given the nature of the competition that they were facing.
Yeah, the Rutgers is outside the top 100 in defensive EPA per play, and the passing success allowed is similar. And so, they didn't have a great defensive front. And that kind of allowed Iowa to do some things that they're not going to be able to do against Indiana.
Looking at the notes from the ranked team that Iowa played earlier, that game against Iowa State, and it's interesting. The game was in Ames, so we do need to take that into account. But it was not a great offensive game, comparatively speaking, for Iowa against Iowa State. It was the type of game Iowa can sometimes grind out and win. But it's interesting because Iowa State has really figured out the formula to winning these games against Iowa. It feels like they've dominated the series in recent years. And, it's fascinating to me, like the EPA per play, EPA per pass. I mean, these are really low numbers for Iowa. And it wasn't like Iowa State set the world on fire. It's just they were better in a lot of those statistical categories than Iowa was. And I do wonder if Iowa just may not have quite the pop in these things, as we've talked about, that we were used to having in previous years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely, Galen. I think there's not a lot of explosion from this offense in a way that I think you would hope. And they do have some athletic receivers, but they've dropped the ball as much as anyone. And like you were saying, there aren't a ton of weapons that he can really lean on. I will say Kamari Moulton is a big running back, and he's going to be hard to break. Like, Indiana's going to miss some tackles this weekend. So the safeties are going to be significant, and I think we're kind of watching the safeties after the first 4 games. So watching the safeties is going to be entertaining or informative, I guess, moving forward, especially in this game. And so I think they're really going to be relying on the running game. But when you play Indiana, you can't really do that all game. You have to have a good quarterback with an arm.
Yeah, this was what the Kevin Wilson offense is, a decade plus ago should have been able to do, was like play good enough defense that the offense scored enough points that it took you out of whatever you were trying to do in terms of just running the ball.
Mm-hmm.
Except now you've got the best of both worlds, because you have a really, really excellent defense if you're Indiana, and you've got an offense that can execute and score points pretty consistently. It's why I think so many people are so optimistic about Indiana in this game, because even if you take the most optimistic view of Iowa, it's like they're going to force a couple turnovers, they're going to grind Indiana up on the line battle, they're going to get a lot of rushing yards. The reality is Indiana's probably going to score consistently throughout the course of the game, because Indiana's offense has so many weapons, and it seems unlikely Iowa's going to be able to bottle all of them up, especially this vintage of Iowa. So it does feel like, matchup-wise, as long as Indiana has a good game plan and isn't intimidated by the environment, it does feel like it's a nice alchemy for Indiana in terms of like where they're at and where Iowa's at and how it relates to what we're talking about going into this one.
Yeah, definitely, Galen. And I think, I think the reason why these patterns in the data work, and the reason why, because a lot of this data is not predictive. A lot of this data is it's reactive. It just paints like what's happened on the field so far, and then it's our job to then take it and make our own predictions. And so there are predictive analytics, but I don't experiment with those quite yet with BSB. But the thing is that, like you were saying, if they have a good game plan and a good scheme, and then they can manage the environment, the reason why the data works is because Indiana's coordinators are so consistent in the way that they scheme. Like I was talking about earlier, they're so consistent at exploiting the weaknesses of the opponent. And that's why I think that there are going to be some passes, especially some deep passes, because that's clearly a weakness. And that's why I think, it's going to be a priority of Bryant Haynes to disrupt the rushing attack. If they can force some negative plays in the rushing game, that's going to put Iowa on their heels, get them as far back away from the first down line as possible for third down. And, Mark Gronowski is not going to be passing for first downs on third down, as we saw in that graphic. So that's the reason why this data is like so accurate in the way that we're able to read it and predict what might happen, because the coordinators have been so good.
Yeah, you mentioned in the preview that Iowa's rushing attack's been a bit odd this year in terms of the statistical gradient, because they're not losing a lot of yards. They don't have a lot of negative plays, but they also don't have a lot of explosive plays. So they've kind of been running in this intermediate range where, and again, this may be where the opponent quality feeds into this. If you don't have to stretch yourself, you can run with kind of impunity because you'll eventually grind your opponent down. And that works if you're facing the kind of opponent that either can't keep up with you physically, or if you're in a situation where you can force turnovers or whatever. That doesn't feel like the case here. And given how good their offensive line is, it is a little odd that they haven't been more successful in the running game thus far than they have been.
Yeah, it's just so interesting, Galen. It's so interesting that they run the ball the 12th most of any team in the FBS with essentially no consequences. They're not scoring a ton of rushing touchdowns. They're not getting much exposure. They're 86th in number of carries over 20 yards. They're like just inside the top 50 in carries over 10 yards. Like you were saying, they don't have a lot of negative plays, but they also don't have a lot of like really positive plays. Right. And so it's interesting. And so, but they're still the 5th highest in rushing success rate because they don't have those negative plays pulling their success down. And so, the Indiana, though, like when you compare the numbers for Indiana and how much they have the 12th lowest rushing success rate allowed, the 12th fewest line yards per rush, and the lowest conversion rate. So like, Iowa relies on the rushing attack to convert first downs. Right. And I think Mark Gronowski is like second to last, or maybe last in the Big Ten in passing first downs. So that's how they get their first downs. And Brian Haynes does not allow that to happen. So it's like two strengths. It's strength versus strength there.
Well, and also something that needs to be mentioned here is Jason Patterson, who's been their leading rusher so far this season, is not playing in this game, out with an ankle injury that he sustained in the Rutgers game. They get Xavier Williams back, and Williams has actually been better on a yards per carry average, but he didn't play in the Rutgers game because he was injured earlier, and he's also a freshman. And so they're going to be rolling with a freshman running back, and then the next highest yardage total for a running back that they have is Terrell Washington Jr., who's a sophomore, and then Kamari Moulton, who's also a sophomore, of 95 and 90 yards respectively. Now, it feels like with Iowa, if it's a running back or a tight end, you can just plug them in and the system is supposed to operate the same way. But that is an interesting thing to think about. Like Kamari Moulton got some yardage last year, but Caleb Johnson was the guy last year for Iowa. And the fact that they're not going to have the guy that's been their leading rusher, and the second stringer is a guy who has been injured and didn't play in the last game, is a really curious dynamic. That's a problem for Iowa going into a game like this where you rely so heavily on a rushing attack.
Yeah, I think Iowa's really going to have to dig into the depth they have in that room. They have a lot of good ball carriers. They have a true freshman. I can't remember his first name. His last name is McNeil, and he popped.
McNeil, yeah,
he popped last week, and so Iowa fans they're actually begging the coaching staff this week to play him. And so I think Moulton he's going to be effective, but he's not going to be able to play the entire game. He's coming off an injury, and he was the number 2 guy last year. It's unfortunate for him. Hopefully he can get back and be healthy, because I would be excited if I was the lead running back going into Iowa's season. But like you were saying, Patterson, he was kind of a pop guy. He's somebody kind of like Kalon Black, where like he runs hard into defenders. He runs very hard. I would say Kalon Black is probably the hardest runner in Indiana's backfield, but it can result in injuries. And so Patterson has a hard time staying healthy. And so, yeah, I think Moulton is going to be their lead guy, but I think they're going to have to turn to Washington. And I'm very curious to see how much they use McNeil, because I think McNeil has talent. I think, in terms of explosion, I think if you're getting an explosive running play, it's probably coming from Patterson. And so the fact that he's not in, I'm curious how much because McNeil looked like he had some athleticism on his carries.
On the receiving end for Iowa, we talked about Jacob Gill earlier on. We talked about a couple other guys that are in the midst for Iowa. I mean, nobody's caught more than 8 balls all season. I have no idea. But 15 people have caught balls for Iowa. They really just will throw it to anybody. It feels like it's kind of fascinating, hard to analyze, but it's also where, the Iowa passing attack kind of feels like when you get like the package of fireworks from the grocery store, like it's a whole bunch of different ones, but none of them really do anything exciting.
Yeah, right. That's a good comparison. They're a good metaphor there, Galen. I like that. I think the one that really popped off the screen for me when I was watching back at the Rutgers game was Sam Phillips. He's kind of a smaller, quicker guy. They actually hit him for like a fairly explosive play. But then he ended up running backwards. It was just like, man, these guys, I don't know about this receiving core. They're like Jacob Gill is their highest. He's probably their most productive. They're probably their best receiver is Jacob Gill, and he's ranked by PFF grade 71st in the Big Ten among receivers. Like not even FBS, like Big Ten. And so
It reminds me of an old Sports Center commercial where like they're all like egging each other on, and someone tells Evander Holyfield that like Charlie Steiner rated him the 50th best heavyweight. And he says, "In the world, in Georgia." It's a similar like being the 71st rated receiver in the Big Ten. That's tough, man. Jeez.
Yeah, exactly. And that's among receivers that have, I think it was like 10 plus targets. So it's not even just guys that get, good grades for a couple targets. It's like guys who are actually involved, and he's ranked 71st. And so there aren't a lot of threats. And that's why I think it, like you were saying, Galen, they could spread it out, which forces you to respect the passing game. And so Indiana's going to have to respect the passing game, but they're probably going to end up doing a lot of what they did against Illinois, which is kind of just like set up this mid-level zone, and then they just, run at the offense, like try to crash the backfield. And, I think it's going to look very similar to what it looked like against Illinois.
Yeah. I'll be honest. Like, I mean, I'm fascinated by what the Indiana defense does against the Iowa offense, how they handle that offensive line. I think it's a great test. It's a great warm-up for Oregon and Penn State in terms of the quality of the individual players and the scheme. But I'm really fascinated to see what the Indiana offense does against the Iowa defense and how that plays out. It was fascinating. You go back to that game in 21, and I mean, clearly Michael Penix wasn't ready, but what was so depressing was how few answers Indiana's offense had for what Iowa was doing against them defensively from the beginning of that game. Now, I'm not anticipating that being the case in this one for Indiana taking on Iowa. I think Mike Shanahan is too good at what he does. I think that, they've got too good of a command of both the personnel and the scheme. I'm just really fascinated to see if Iowa can dent what Indiana's done offensively up to this point. I'm not expecting Indiana to score 63 points again, but I am interested if Indiana can find success, if they really can impose themselves in terms of like line yards per rush, the way they have thus far on the course of the season. They've shown they will just run the ball really effectively. They'll go to RPOs. Fernando Mendoza, when he's keeping it, knows where to put it. I'm really curious where the success comes from IU and where Iowa's best chances are to disrupt Indiana defensively as they face this Mendoza-led offense. What do you think?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I think there are a lot of points where there are questions. Iowa has one of the best defensive end duos in the country. I'm trying to remember their names. For some reason, they're escaping me. Yeah, Ethan Herkett and Max Llewellyn. And those two guys, like Deontay Craig, I think Indiana fans remember Deontay Craig. Oh, yeah. He was not the most like effective pass rusher as a defensive end, and now he's replaced by Llewellyn. And Llewellyn, he is already he already has like a greater sack total than Deontay Craig had all of last season. He's a better pass rusher. They have a better pass rushing defensive line this year. Maybe not so much in run defense, but like in pass defense or a pass rush, they should have a better defensive line this year. It just hasn't really shown that much. Their interior defensitive linemen are graded by PFF higher than Indiana's interior in terms of pass rush, which is impressive to me. I think there are a lot of points of penetration with this offensive line that hasn't necessarily needed to prove itself yet, which is, can Khalil Benson handle Ethan Herkett, who last year was a really effective pass rushing defensive end? And if he stunts in, can Bray Lynch handle him? We saw Bray Lynch struggle with stunts against Ohio State and Notre Dame. So there are some points where I'm not concerned, but I'm just curious to see what it looks like against the defensive line like this that really can rush the passer on paper anyway. And so I'm curious about that. I'm also cognizant of the fact that Indiana's offense and their passing offense is a very different scheme than Rutgers. Rutgers essentially runs like no play action and no screen game. It's pretty much they're like, we have athletic big guys on the outside. We're just going to spread you out. We're going to line up in shotgun, and we're just going to give it to Callie McManus, and he's going to throw it downfield. He has the highest average depth of target in the Big Ten, and they said again, Galen?
Rutgers is Al Davis's favorite Big Ten team this year.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Wow, clearly, but yes, go on. Yeah.
Yeah, so they scheme the receivers open in that type of a scheme. Indiana's is much more reliant on misdirection, and they also have the RPO, which can help an offensive line. I'm just kind of curious what Mike Shanahan does in that regard. Does he stay with the RPO? Does he go to more of a drop back game? I doubt that, but that'll be something to look forward to. And I think whatever it is, Mike Shanahan has shown that he can scheme to the weaknesses of the defense. So I'm just curious what he thinks the weakness of the defense is for his offense. Because I think Rutgers figured it out for their offense. They just couldn't, execute to the end. But yeah, I think the passing game is open there, and I'm like you said, Galen, they're number one in line yards per rush. This offensive line has gotten a push, and it's been a little surprising. I knew they were going to be good defending or blocking for the run. I knew they were going to be good because Khalil Benson's a really good run blocking offensive lineman at right tackle. I just didn't know they were going to be this good in terms of getting that push. So I kind of want to see it against on the road against Iowa and their front. And not that I'm doubting Indiana at all. I just want to see that.
Well, no, I think it's very reasonable because Indiana's going. I mean, you at this point, if you're an IU fan, you should want to see Indiana in these types of situations where they have to go up against threats. And it was the big question mark about Illinois was, would they actually be a threat, or was it just a statistically like a manifested kind of thing? And then it turned out it was the latter and not the former. It may be the same here, but again, because of the early statistical noise and the fact that Iowa has played a poor schedule and so is Indiana, you're still trying to get strength on strength comparisons where you can really figure out how good, like what is the actual ceiling for Indiana and these sorts of things. So that's where I'm certainly very excited about it, because you get a chance to work that out and see in live round football what exactly the parameters are of this IU offense and the IU defense for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good thing. I like that a lot. It's also going to be interesting because weather-wise, this game is not like the toughest thing this game is going to be dealing the players are going to be dealing with is probably a little hot. It's going to be a real feel of 88 in Iowa City.
Oh,
tomorrow.
Really?
Yeah, 87 degrees and sunny. Doesn't feel like fall weather in Iowa, but right now the forecast in Iowa City, 87 degrees for the high, very, very sunny, no cloud cover at all, 8-mile-an-hour wind coming out of the southwest with some gusts up into the low 20s. And this is right in the middle of the afternoon. So you're going to get maximum heat, radiation, whatever the meteorological terms are for that. So there's some endurance elements to that as well. Now, Indiana's played in those conditions already this year. That was essentially what the games against Old Dominion and Kennesaw State were played in those conditions. So it's not going to be new for them. But that is something to keep in mind. There's not going to be a lot of nasty weather that's going to impact the offenses of either way. So it's nice because it will be kind of like there'll be kind of maybe some greatest show on turf kind of opportunities if Indiana wanted to really press the action. And I like that better than trying to go play in some bad weather at this point.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I didn't realize it was going to be that warm. I went to Miguel Cabrera's last game with the Tigers. It was like October 3rd or something like a couple years ago, and it was like 85 degrees in Detroit, and I was like, "What is happening right now?" But yeah, that's kind of what that reminds me of. Is that the 88 degrees. I think it's going to be a tough game for the trenches. That's why I think this Indiana could really, and I posted this on Twitter recently. Indiana could really make a statement in the trenches tomorrow. I think if they win this game as big as I personally think they can, I think that it's going to be a massive statement, like you were saying, Galen, for this offensive line, but also for the defensive line. I think you do that to two teams like Illinois and Iowa in a row. Like if the defensive front can do what they did to Illinois for a second straight week against an opponent like this. I mean, what are they gonna do against Oregon? You know, like yeah.
No. So as we wrap things up, give me your score prediction for this game, and if there's any particular things beyond what you just said about like looking at what the line does and how they perform in this game. Anything else that you'd like to really see, as a proof of concept, I guess, for the rest of the season?
I'll say, as far as the score, I don't know if I was going to get to 21 points. I think, like SP Plus was predicting. I think, man, Galen, I'm really optimistic for Indiana in this one. I think they could get, to like 32 and hold Iowa to, I'll say 13. I don't see this defense surrendering, 21 points to, I think 13 is even kind of high. I think Indiana, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Yeah. I think like 32 to 13, Indiana.
I think there's going to be a little bit of a come down for Indiana. I don't see, I mean, the one thing I'm worried about for IU is the letdown that often happens when you beat the hell out of a highly ranked opponent and then got to turn around and go on the road to a team that's proud, has a good system, and as Curt Cignetti said, isn't going to beat themselves. So I do think that there's going to be some tough sledding at various points in this game. And I think this is good for Indiana that they face this and that they have to deal with a team that's a live wire in terms of their physicality, in terms of like a systems-based approach where you're not going to beat yourself too much. Now, that said, I also think that as you and I were exchanging some texts earlier, I think Kinnick is not necessarily the fortress that it's sometimes portrayed as, in terms of when you look at what has happened at Kinnick, they generally lose at least a game a year there. They lost to Iowa State at home last year. They lost at home to Minnesota in 2023. They lost to Iowa State, Michigan, and Nebraska in 2022. They lost to Purdue at home in 2021. They lost to Northwestern at home in 2020. I could go on. That doesn't mean that they're not tough at home. And we've seen good teams go in and lose in Kinnick. But I would be allowing my natural IU football pessimism to unnecessarily sway me if I didn't go back to what I talked about at the beginning of this show about my faith in the coaching staff to prep and get the players ready and get a scheme going that really takes advantage of Iowa's weak spots. I also think they're going to be really focused on trying to chew up clock and trying to give Iowa as few possibilities, both in special teams and in terms of what offense they have to do damage. So I think it might be a lower scoring game than perhaps we saw at IU's peak last year. I'm going to say Indiana wins this one, let's say 30-14. I think it's going to be somewhere in that range, but maybe about somewhere between a 12 and a 16-point victory for Indiana. Comfortable, but one of those games where you look back on it and you're like, well, they didn't blow them out. I don't think that that's necessary here, and I think Curt Cignetti realizes that. You don't want to expose yourself unnecessarily, but you do want to get enough points on the board where you're not leaving anything to chance.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Galen, especially going into the Oregon game in a couple weeks after that. But I'll add that I love tight ends. I love tight ends, and so and I know Indiana fans are becoming enamored with the blocking tight end, the run blocking tight end. It was Zach Horton last year, Riley Nowakowski this year. Iowa has the second highest graded blocking tight end in the Big Ten, Hayden Large, a very appropriate last name. And he's graded above Riley Nowakowski and Holden Stace. So I'm going to be watching Hayden Large and see, how they work him in compared to the way that Mike Shanahan works in his tight ends. And I encourage any CrimsonCast listeners to tweet at me when they see it as well. I'm a big tight end fan.
Keep an eye on the tight ends. That's a good idea. Oftentimes with Iowa, that's one of the few things to keep an eye on with their games. But they always seem to find a way to mix them in. And so we'll keep that in mind, obviously. Well, Taylor, as always, really appreciate your insights and all the work you do on Bite Sized Bison. And always a joy having you on. We look forward to chatting with you again soon about more IU football.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Galen.
Absolutely. And thanks to all of you folks. Whether you are watching the game at home or whether you're making the trip to Eastern Iowa, we wish you the best of luck and enjoyment as the Hoosiers take on the Iowa Hawkeyes. IU looking to build on the success that they had against Illinois and push their record to 5-0 on the season. For CrimsonCast and the Backroom Network, I'm Galen Clavio. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.